Paul event. We called it From Burma to Bhopal, and so much of you guys were there. I organized it with a very good friend and the faculty advisor of A.I.D, Robin. And this has been a year when, since he suddenly passed away. He had a heart attack last year, a few days after the event. And you know, he's just such a wonderful person. Hopefully you got a chance to look at his picture that's sitting on the A table and read more about him. If you haven't, I really would encourage you to do so. There's a memorial being held for him later this week as well. We're very fortunate to have with us Renu, his wife, and Dimple, his daughter. And they're going to, if you knew Govind, he didn't like ceremonies. So we decided to do the ceremony. But it's a very small, tiny thing. They're going to kind of light a candle in his memory, and also in the memory of the violence, victims of the violence in Mumbai. Since the last couple of weeks we've been hearing the news about that. And of course the folks we're going to talk about in Bhopal and the farmers who are losing their. So we will talk more about the context of what's happening. Trouble through empty hallways, whispers that cut hearts out. Who pierces what inside? Who penetrates? Who bleeds? There was once a woman who dared to open and lay down and wait, but what came to her? What was it? The world laps, its bloody tongue giving it a name. Virginity, a tightness, a closure, a thing to be ripped, robbed, explored, but why must it be the other who tears it? Are we not, all of us, perverse in the end? Do we not thrust ourselves into the narrowest tunnels, darkest tunnels, looking for what we deem as light, a passage out, an escape before death? Have we not invented God in order to make a place for the devil? Do we not carve out peace after we have pointed our bayonets at our enemies and plunged? Is there a dawn soaked in dew of no color at all that exists despite us, uncorrupted with words or designs? The woman opens her mouth, lets her tongue fall. Maybe the wet morning will, by mistake, enter her and fill her womb so that she can become once again impenetrable.
In the middle of the night, on December 2nd, 1984, 27 tons of toxic gases leaked from Union Carbide's pesticide plant. The men, women, and children of Bhopal who worked and lived around it were awakened by horrors. Those who survived said it was like chilies burning in their eyes. They couldn't breathe or see anything. They left their homes and ran into the streets, vomiting, foaming at the mouth, being trampled. They had little help, no warning. Even after thousands died, Union Carbide claimed that the gas was not poisonous. That was only the beginning of the nightmare. The Indian government and Union Carbide will continue to fail the people decade after decade. Instead of accepting responsibility, Carbide fled India, leaving behind a site so contaminated that chemicals have seeped into the groundwater. Lead and mercury have been found in women's breast milk, putting future generations in peril. Birth defects, tuberculosis, and cancers are on the rise. The gas leak could have been avoided if compromises had not been made to save costs. Bhopal isn't only about charred lungs, poisoned kidneys, and deformed fetuses. It's also about corporate crime, multinational skullduggery, injustice, dirty deals, medical malpractice, corruption, callousness, and contempt for the poor. Nothing else explains why the victim's average compensation was just $500 for a lifetime of misery.
Bhopal has never left my mind. It gnaws at me in the middle of the night as I play with old dolls in rags without a change of clothes. Children should have childhood. This much I think we all agree. And it is rare that we all agree, and so it must be true. Like God or lack of God, both used to explain, pacify, cajole us into living in the middle of the night. The victims haven't given up. Their struggle for justice and dignity is one of the most valiant anywhere. They have unbelievable energy and hope. The fight has not ended. It won't, as long as our collective conscience continues to stir.
We have flames, not flowers. We will not wilt down before your corporate power. We are flames, not flowers. We will not wilt down before your corporate power. With brooms in hand, we're going to sweep you away, because we'll fight with justice till our dying day.
Department at Emory, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the South Asian Studies program here, and dare I say, if I may, A.I.D as well. It's a pleasure to have you here and to introduce and welcome P. Sainath, who's a remarkable man for his and this generation. P. Sainath is an award-winning, can you hear me all right? Yes. He's an award-winning Indian journalist and author dedicating to recording an India that is seldom visible. He has won over 30 national and international awards and fellowships in his 26 years as a dedicated journalist, and the awards include the Raman Magsaysay Award, often referred to as the Asian Nobel, for journalism, literature, and creative communication arts, the A.H. Burma Award in 2001, and the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism in 2000. In July 2004, he was awarded the Prem Bhatia Award for Excellence in Political Reporting and Analysis in recognition of his, I'll quote here, outstanding, indeed exceptional work on the problems of the poorest of the poor, especially in Andhra Pradesh, unquote. He is the Rural Affairs Editor at The Hindu, a contributor for India Together, and the author of Everybody Loves a Good Drought. His work has won praise from the likes of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who has referred to him as one of the world's great experts on famine and hunger. P. Sainath reminds us that globalization is a beast with many faces. As another observer of globalization, Salman Rushdie has put it, some of them are always sad. Please join me in welcoming P. Sainath.
Can you hear me clearly back there? May I request the audience to join me, to rise and join me in a minute's silence in memory of the over 180 people killed in Mumbai. Not in any way connected with the subject that I'm speaking on today, but there's a connection with something that's been written. I've been looking at authors and writers talking about the resilience and spirit of Bombay and going back to work the very next day. And if you actually look at it from the perspective of the people who are going back to work the very next day, it's not just about resilience and courage. The vast majority of that city's population cannot eat if they do not work. It's as simple as that. So even if you're terrified, even if you're horrified, even if you are really worried, you just go back and so I found myself a little uncomfortable with the, with that view of it as I did, with the view of Taj Hotel being the iconic symbol of Mumbai, for God's sake. I mean, okay, you can say that of maybe the gateway of India, right? The much greater symbol was that of the Victoria terminus, where the maximum number of people died, and much more people were wounded, but which got far less play because it's not a five-star hotel, and basically 3 million poor people who use those trains, or less well-off people who use the railway station. It also seems to have the two suburban railway lines of Bombay, the Western and Central line, Churchgate and VT. These two railway lines carry 6.2 million passenger trips a day. That's more than, say, the population of Finland or countries like that, every day. And Victoria Terminus accounts for about 3.5 million of that, now called Chhatrapati Shivaji train terminus. also, because of the focus being where it was, not many people are aware that the one gunman taken alive was not taken by army commandos or special action forces. He was taken by a couple of typical Bombay policemen with lathis, with batons. They went after a guy with an AK-47 and brought him back. Okay. You could see the Indian baton. It's not like the one the American police carry. It's just a thin stick of bamboo. The two guys, the only guy taken alive from the attackers was taken by a couple. Now, the reason I mention this is that those two policemen, go and see how they live. They belong to that class which, if they don't work, they don't eat. They come from the chawls and the slums of Bombay. That's where they come, because most havaldars and constables will live in such conditions. That's Bombay. Bombay is also the capital of the state of Maharashtra, the richest state in many ways, home to the Mumbai Stock Exchange, etc., etc., etc. Here's a much less known fact about Mumbai, apart from the fact that 180 people died in this appalling outrage, which all of you are aware of. The state of Maharashtra has seen 34,000 farmers commit suicide in 10 years between 1997 and 2006. Now the new data coming out for 2007, which takes the total to over 38,000 farm suicides. These are the pictures of the farmers who committed suicides or their families, portraits of those families. I don't think you have read much or seen much about that. These are not 200 people, they are 38,000 who have committed suicide since 1997 as part of an agrarian crisis, the largest we have had since the eve of the Green Revolution. But let me take you to a bright side of it. One of my favorite amusements is surfing websites of institutions that simply did not exist in India 15 years ago. Okay. They're really wonderful because when you're talking about those policemen and Victoria Terminus, you're talking about another Bombay, you're talking about another Mumbai, you're talking about incredible disparity and inequality that characterizes that city and which characterizes Indian development of the last 15, 20 years. Let me take that a little further and tell you about, say, let's look at schools, the kind of schools that have come up since 1991, 92. Well, one of them is a very old school, but let me take you through two schools. You can look up their websites. It's fascinating. One is the Goenka International School in Delhi, whose website promises to make your child a truly rounded global citizen. And towards that end, will expose your child to various aspects of global culture. One of which is that your child will eat a different cuisine every day in the canteen. One day Chinese, one day Thai, one day Mexican, and they even managed to fit in Indian on one day. So this is an institution of a kind that you never heard of 15, 20 years ago. The fees are in 5 figures and much more, maybe 6 figures in some schools. That's one. The second school that's my favorite is the Sanskriti school in Delhi. This is a school so elite that the children of cabinet ministers find it difficult to get in. On its website, again, something that you would never have seen in India 15, 16 years ago. On its web, this school got 150 million rupees in freebies from the government of Delhi in terms of subsidized land and various other throwaways given to the elite of the elite, the creme de la creme. Its website says, the chairperson of our school board will always be the wife of whoever is the serving cabinet secretary of the government of India. So I wrote them a letter. I wrote to them saying, hey, what happens if the cabinet secretary is a woman? Let's be optimistic. Let's be optimistic. Then they removed that page from their website. But I had saved the page, so you can still have a look at it. Yeah. The chairperson of our board is the wife of, then I think a lot of other nasty comments came in and people asked what happens if the cabinet secretary has more than one wife, and all sorts of allusions were made to serving cabinet secretaries at the time. So then they took that off the website. The third is a much more venerable institution in Mumbai. These two are in Delhi, the first two are in Delhi. The third is a venerable school in Mumbai known as the Bombay Scottish School. The Bombay Scottish School really made the front pages in Mumbai in 2006 for extraordinary reasons. You see, by and large, it was a school whose parents, it was all for children whose parents were basically millionaires, okay? So that's fine. I mean, there was some solidarity in that sense. Now, in the 90s, India developed a new creature. And into this Garden of Eden crept the serpent known as billionaires. Now, the school came up with a huge problem. It had some 4 or 5 billionaires in the parents. Every year at the annual day, the school puts out a big shamiana and its school sporting events and everything. It keeps a special enclave, an enclosure for the millionaires. Now, what do you do when you've got billionaires? So they had to create a spot within the spot for the billionaires, and this led to the outbreak of a bitter class struggle between billionaires and millionaires. No prizes for guessing who won. So, for 3 days, this was on the front pages of the newspapers. The class struggle between these guys. And just try thinking back 15, 20 years ago to any existence of such institutions. Something dramatic has happened in 15, 20 years, and that's the inequality that I want to put before you. The tragedy in Mumbai has been rightly covered. It's been covered intensely. It's been covered widely. What about the tragedy of the 38,000 farmers who committed suicide? The Center for Media Studies, Delhi, shows that the share of agriculture in coverage in the 6 major TV channels and 6 major newspapers is less than 0.6%, and entertainment alone gets 7 to 9 times what agriculture, health, education, environment together get in the media. And mind you, that's not counting crime, which is largely run as entertainment. Yeah, it is, like Sanjay Nanda, BMW. That crime is really about a celebrity, and it's about entertainment. It's not about crime. In fact, the media's dismal failure in covering the agrarian crisis is so appalling. Last year, I was in Vidarbha, which is the worst affected area of the crisis in terms of farm suicides. Not necessarily in terms of the crisis itself, but in terms of the suicides. And I'm standing in ground zero of the farm suicide zone, addressing journalists who have covered these crises. And one of them, a very venerable correspondent of a very venerable newspaper who has had 25 years experience, stands up and says, yeah, Mr. Sainath, we know all this stuff, we've also covered it, maybe you've done more, but we've also covered it. Now let me ask you a question about all these chaps who committed suicide. All these farmers, you know what they are. Are they not drunkards? I mean, isn't that why they took their lives? Because they're drunkards, basically. You know how rampant alcoholism is over here. I reflected on this question and told them what I thought. You see, fair enough. I mean, alcohol is a problem. I mean, we all know that. But if excessive consumption of alcohol is the driving cause behind suicides, there'd be no journalists left in the world. Very few anyway. Very few anyway. Anyway, that approach to ordinary people, that contempt for people, is also an outcome of the mindset of inequality that we have constructed over the last 15, 20 years. India today See, all these stories of India shining, India blooming, they are true. They are true of a very narrow percentage of the population. A very narrow percentage of the population. Look at the success stories. India today has $51 billionaires. Another favorite website of mine, permanently bookmarked. ForbesBillionaires.com. Gives me enormous solace and soothe when I feel bad about anything. I look at India's in the ForbesBillionaires.com. I mean, this is because it's no longer satisfying to me that we have, apart from these guys, we have 112,000 millionaires. But, when you've seen 1 millionaire, you've seen them all. India now ranks 4th in the world in dollar billionaires. Ahead of us are only 3 countries. The 800-pound gorilla, Russia and Germany. Okay? Russia and Germany have numerically more billionaires than we do, but the net asset worth of our billionaires, I'll have you know, is far more than theirs. Meaning that our net worth of our 51 billionaires is $335 billion, which is 31% of India's GDP. Okay. Their net asset worth is equal to 51 individuals, their net asset worth is equal to 31% of the GDP of a country of over 1 billion human beings. The Russians make something like 270 billion, or they have 89 billionaires, but together they only manage a paltry 270 billion. And the other difference between our billionaires and Russian billionaires is that when you've made lots of it, our billionaires don't go to prison for 15 years. At that stage, we send them to parliament. So you have this country that is 4th in the world in the number of dollar billionaires and 128th in human development and quality of human life index in the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index, okay, which are by far the broadest and the best indicators that you can get within a very flawed field. Okay. We are 128. The list of countries above us includes El Salvador, Ecuador, Gabon, Botswana. It includes the occupied territories of the Palestine, which haven't seen a peaceful day in 60 years. Okay? It includes all these countries. What's striking about all those countries, that say El Salvador is 25 positions ahead of us. Nicaragua is ahead of us. What's striking about all these countries which are ahead of us? A, none of them has an economy growing at 9%. None of them is a software superpower. None of them is a nuclear power. And most of them have had war as long as they can remember going on their soil. But they still manage to give a better quality of life, to rank better in the Human Development Index. I mean, Cuba is 55, for instance. Yeah? And we are 128. Now, in these billionaires, 4 of our billionaires are 4 of the top 10 richest men in the planet. Now, I don't know post-meltdown how this affects, and maybe a couple of zeros get locked off. But let me tell you how much they make and the rate at which they make it. My other favorite source of wealth measurement is the ultimate Indian oracle, the Times of India, which tracks wealth on a second-by-second, moment-by-moment basis. The Times of India did a 90-day test last year on the top 10 rich people in India to see how much they were earning and at what rate. Now these 10 guys, which include 4 of the world's richest men, these 10 guys together in 90 days, it could be 90, they did a 90-day and a 180 days, 3 months and 6 months, but depending on how you take it, in that period they earned $65.3 billion. That's about, if you take it as a 3-month period, then that's about $725 million a day, or $700,000 a minute if it's a 3-month period, and half of that if it's a 6-month period. It's not clear from the way they put their spend. That's the highest rate of earning in our history. Now, of those top 10, one is Mr. Mukesh Ambani, You guys think it's a little gross, don't you, that the 3 auto major CEOs went in their corporate jets to Washington? Mukesh Ambani would not do any such thing, because what corporate jets from which airport? He's putting up 3 helipads in his house. He doesn't want to inconvenience the general public. So, he's got 3 helipads in a house that is 60 floors. You can Google it and look it up. It's there for all, in all its magnificence. Each floor is done in a different style that will have nothing in common with the next floor. That's India's unity in diversity. Now, you just Google it up, you'll see Mukesh Ambani, 60 floors, helipads, and you'll see. Each floor has its own private gym. Now, in the period that these guys were making, I don't know how many dollars a minute, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute, the wages of agricultural laborers in India, the most vulnerable section of the Indian population, in that period, peaked at $1.50 per day. And that is the highest payment because it's on a government program called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Okay? 67 rupees is the minimum. And you can get 80, you can get 90, but still $1.50 at the maximum. And agricultural laborers are not in number, they are not 51. They are in tens of millions. So at one end of the spectrum, you have a bunch of 10 guys making $700,000 a minute. At the other end, you have millions and millions of people making less than $1.50 on those days that they find work. Now, the shining brigade, A, it doesn't read, or B, it doesn't want to find out. You all know about the World Bank's $1 a day, $2 a day poverty measures. Forget it. If you want, we'll show you the report. We have it on that. We have it on the same thing that has this. The National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector analyzed our National Sample Survey Organization's data on poverty from the latest data of the National Sample Survey Organization. Here is what it says. 836 million. Remember, 51 guys, 31% of GDP. 836 million Indians get by on less than 50 cents a day. 836 million Indians live on less than 20 rupees a day. That's much less than 50 cents right now. The NCUS report is the latest. It's the August 2007 report, handed over to the Prime Minister by Dr. Arjun Sengupta, with all the credentials of having served the Reserve Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, the Planning Commission. That's who produced the report. You can download it. It's available on NICNET. It's the reports on livelihoods, in the conditions of work and livelihoods. And the report is by the National Commission for the Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. We can even show you the page which gives you the quote, because it happens to be page 1. So you have, this last month, 14th of November, the government of India put in an affidavit in the Supreme Court because some non-profit challenged the government of India on its poverty definition, which meant that the government had to spell out what its poverty definition was and say what the line was. The non-profit challenged the government, saying, when food prices have increased so steeply, when wheat alone has increased 77% in the first 3 months of 2008, you cannot stick to the old poverty estimates. You must have a new poverty line. The government said that it saw no reason to change its poverty line, and in the process, in its affidavit, gave out its figures on what the poverty line is. Speaking of Mumbai, the resilience, you will be pleased to know that if you earn 38 cents a day in Mumbai, you are above the poverty line. In rural India, 23 cents will do. You'll get by. You're above the poverty line. So these 836 million people who get by on less than 50 cents a day, most of them are above the poverty line. Most of them are above the poverty line. Okay? Less than a third of these 836 million are below the poverty line. Incidentally, if you want to go further into that 836 million, 88% of all Dalits and Adivasis fall into that category, and much less known, 85% of all Muslims fall into the category of those 836 million. All these figures are there for you on the front page. If you want towards the end, we'll put that up of the report from there. And the other thing, that fantastic thing that the report's analysis of NSS data shows us is that the gap between the super rich and the rich is probably much larger than the gap between the rich and the poor. Because the concentration is so extreme at one end of the spectrum. You're talking about 0.01% of the population. Well, we're talking about 51 guys with 31% of GDP equivalent. Okay. In this period, between 2004 and 2007, the number of billionaires grew at the rate of 1.5 every month. Okay. So we started out with a paltry 4 or 8, and now there we are 51. We may have slid down after the meltdown. We'll know that when Forbes puts out its next list in March. At the same time that we were turning out billionaires and dollar millionaires, and the noted nutritionist George W. was telling the world that food prices are high because Indians are eating more. It's not just George W. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal agreed with it. They agreed with it. They wrote editorials where, they didn't say we agree with it, but they said the same thing. Here's a simple fact of life. The per capita availability of food grain per Indian, meaning food per Indian in terms of pulses and cereals, has declined and declined sharply almost every damn year of the so-called reforms of the last 15, 20 years. In 1991, food grain available per Indian. You can also, where are the figures from? All the numbers are from the government of India because there is no alternative source. And you can easily get this number by going onto the net and going to table A22. So if anyone wants to take that down, table A22 of the Government of India's Economic Survey, which is a document the finance minister places on the floor of the house, or the tables in the floor of the house, at the time of the budget session. So before the budget is presented, they present a document called Economic Survey of India, Government of India's Economic Survey. And that gives you all the tables. This is table A22. 1991, food grain per Indian, that is cereals and pulses, 510 grams per citizen. That's the average. 1991. What is it for the last year for which figure is available? 2006. What's the figure? From 510 grams, 422 grams. That's not a fall of 88 grams. That's a fall of 88 grams into 365 days into 1 billion people, which means the average poor family is consuming 100 kilograms less of food grain than it did 8 or 10 years ago. While 10 to 20% of us at one end of the spectrum are eating better than we have ever done in our history. Both realities are true. Okay? Both realities are true. That's India. The truth is the incredible disparity. Oh yes, the phenomenal consumption at one end, the phenomenal wealth concentration at one end, and then there is this. This is the country that now boasts as being the primary destination for medical tourism. Which means that middle-class Americans can fly business class, get surgeries done in India, and it's still cheaper than getting it done here. Okay? But 200 million Indians have ceased to seek medical attention of any kind because they can no longer afford it. So CEO salaries have been going up everywhere, and the one list on which nobody can beat us, not even the 800-pound gorilla. Forbes has a list of world's costliest weddings. You're outclassed. At the top is Mr. Lakshmi Mittal. He's poor guy. You can't blame him. He was in Paris and he was trying to get his daughter married, and at that season in Paris it's very difficult to get a wedding hall. So he just didn't have a choice. He hired the Palace of Versailles instead, and he had the wedding there, and it cost him 60 million pounds. Or it doesn't matter what currency, rubles or what. We just don't see anyway. Now the country that has these guys also ranks. Not only do we rank 128 in the Human Development Index, which means we are in the bottom 50 nations of the world, okay? But within those bottom 50, we are down there at the worst when it comes to child malnourishment. When it comes to child nutrition, we are worse than Ethiopia, we are worse than Burkina Faso, we are worse than Sierra Leone, we are worse than Guinea-Bissau, who are 169 to 175 in that index. Percentage of Indian children, underweight under the age of 5. Here you are. Guinea-Bissau, 25%. Burkina Faso, 35%. Sierra Leone, 38%. Ethiopia, 38%. India, 47%. This is for children below 5. And within that 47%, you'll find a disproportionate number of girl children. Okay? They get much less to eat than the boy does. So, now, okay, we know that there's been this inequality. We know there has been this inequality. We know that inequality has been there before in India. So what's so special or new about this inequality? How is it different from, there is a major difference. The major difference is this, that never before was the inequality so cynically constructed, so ruthlessly engineered by design, with planning, with the idea that this is how it's going to change. You're all familiar with the trickle-down theory. I got so much food on my table, some of it has got to fall off and you get to eat. So, yeah, in this period, when you have inequality growing, much of the principles which I'm talking about are pretty similar to what happened in the United States at a different level, in a different standard of living. Agriculture always takes the worst hit. It's anyway an underprivileged sector. I'm not talking about corporate agriculture. I'm talking about agriculture as practiced by human beings. Agriculture is anyway a highly disadvantaged sector. Its average wages are much lower than elsewhere. Its average income is much lower than elsewhere per family. Between 91 and 2001, the two censuses of India in that period, 8 million people quit farming. And we do not have a study which tells us where they went. We have 8 million human beings who quit farming. We know that by looking at the number of cultivators in the two censuses, which has fallen from 111 million to 100 million. Did they go and find jobs in industry? Oh no. Maybe they went to Mr. Tata, remember? He's the guy who owns Taj Hotel in Bombay, who thinks his people did a wonderful job of security. Yeah. Now Mr. Tata is also the owner of one of the biggest steel plants, the Jamshedpur steel plant of the Tatas. So maybe all these 8 million farmers went there and got jobs, not really. In 1991, the Tatas used to produce 1 million tons of steel with 85,000 workers. By 2005, they were producing 5 million tons of steel with half that number of workers. Or maybe they went to Bajaj, Pune, the biggest manufacturer of two-wheelers in the world at one stage. Not really, because Bajaj used to produce 1 million scooters a year with 24,000 workers. Now they have 10,000 workers, but they produce 2.5 million scooters a year. So, and now they're all heavily into layoffs further. So where did these people go? Where did they go? It's your answers to that are as good as mine. And the NCUS report itself tells us that the change in formal employment was either nil or marginally negative. Those are its words. All over the world, a set of processes have taken place which really plunged the Indian agrarian sector, already in internal crisis, down the tube. What were these sectors? What were these policy packages all over the world? You can see them unfolding even today in the United States. First, withdrawal of the state from sectors that matter to poor people. I maintain that the state has not withered away and it's not less interventionist. I say that the nation state in 2007, 2008 is more interventionist than it has ever been on behalf of the rich. You know, according to the United Nations, if you have $60 to $80 billion additional spending each year, you can solve the basic problems of illiteracy, health, sanitation, literacy, housing. These basic problems you can solve by spending $60. But governments have always told us, there's no money. Man, when Wall Street crashes, they can put up $1.5 trillion. There's money. The UK finds money. Germany finds money. You've got $1.5 trillion raised in a couple of weeks when it affects the soups. Otherwise, you don't have money. 60 to 80 billion dollars. We've been talking that number. It's attached to the Millennium Development Goals also. You can see the number, 60 to 80 billion dollars. There's no money. Second process, huge expenditure cuts. I just flew in from California, where they're having a round-the-clock session of the legislature to decide on what to cut, because they've got to cut, because they've got a budget deficit of $11 billion. That's what you spend on 1 week on your wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's 1 week's worth of war. Okay? It's going to lead to huge cuts in California's services for its ordinary citizens. And California is not only the biggest state in the United States, it would be in the top 10 economies of the world if it were treated as an economy. I mean, maybe in the top 12 or 15 economies in the world if treated as a separate nation. Right? You're crushed under a budget deficit of 11 billion, but you're fighting a $3 trillion war according to Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz. Third, slashing of subsidies and support from people who need the most. Fourth, transfer of wealth, systematic transfer of wealth. All these points, by the way, were written about 6 years ago and they haven't changed one bit. The systematic transfer of wealth and resources from poor to rich, it's happening today in DC. Whose money is going into bailout who? Who works under what conditions with the money? The UAW is agreeing to further cuts, further rollbacks, and the heads of GM, Chrysler and Ford fly in their corporate jets to negotiate bailouts in Congress. Actually, I think it's very unfair. I read somebody in the New York Times calling these guys, the auto industry, calling them dinosaurs. I think that's extremely uncharitable and unfair to the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were extremely adaptable animals, creatures that ruled the planet for 150 million years. These guys are more like the asteroid that fried the dinosaurs. Then you have maybe the most important of these processes, which is central. It's unfolding before your eyes in this country. For me, this is the most central of the processes. The unprecedented rise of corporate power. Just dictating everything, rewriting every law. What was Bhopal about? It was about the coming of that kind of corporate power to India. By the way, there's a connection with farming. What was that poison in Bhopal? Pesticides. Kids are in the fields when such pesticides are sprayed. Sometimes they do the spraying, especially when it comes to cotton. India's biggest cotton, one of the second biggest cotton producer. Then another process, the imposition of user fees and costs on people who cannot afford it. So you have medical tourism, because your surgeries here would cost you literally an arm and a leg. Okay, but in India you can get it done cheap, but people there can't afford to even consult a doctor. Very large numbers of them. Sixth process, mindless deregulation. Seventh, the process which I call the privatization of everything from intellect to soul. It's one of the intriguing phraseologies of this millennium. One word that has come back in vogue is public intellectual. Why do we use it? Because the rest have become private. We have to mark out a guy who's not talking on behalf of Rockefeller or Ford or some other funder. He's a public intellectual. And the stunning rise in inequality that has characterized the last quarter of a century. And lastly, what I call the ideology of market fundamentals. As religious a fundamentalism as any other, far more vicious and vehement than any other basic recruiting agency for all other fundamentalisms, because of the number of hundreds of millions of livelihoods that it has destroyed. Let me talk about this farm crisis now in 5 words. What is the Indian agrarian crisis? 5 words. The drive towards corporate farming. In a country where 60% of the population are one way or the other linked to, dependent on agriculture, we are displacing millions of people, 8 million as I said, without firing a shot, without taking bazookas, without tanks, without army, but you're crashing agriculture, tanking agriculture, so people leave anyway. Yeah? Yeah? Without firing a shot, you've got rid of 8 million people. But the thing is, not that they leave, which is one set of issues. Where do they go? How do you absorb them? What options have you given them? What alternatives have you created? I've shown you that it's not in industry, it's not in manufacturing. Where the heck do they go? That's one set of issues. So in five words, the drive towards corporate farming is what I call the agrarian crisis. How does this unfold? How does this unfold? It unfolds in terms of 5 words. Predatory commercialization of the countryside. And it represents 5 words, biggest displacement in our history. It's not from a dam, it's not from a canal, it's not from a power plant, it's from agriculture. It's the largest displacement because India has the largest body of smallholder farmers in the planet. In the United States, you had, when I last looked, 700,000 family farms going bankrupt at the rate of 160 a week. Now this means, that's an Associated Press figure, it used to be 370 a week, the bankruptcies. They've come down because the total number has shrunk. So the intensity is about the same, the base has shrunk. It also means that you have 3 times the number of people in prison than you do in farming. Because you have 2.3 million people in state and federal penitentiaries. So you have a lot more people in prison in this country than you do, and people farm. I'm not talking about industrial agriculture. Some very broad principles for understanding the agrarian crisis, which I believe is worldwide. One of the broad principles is, do not disconnect rural from urban. You'll be missing the wood for the trees. The policies are made in the urban, the fallout is in the rural. Do not disconnect rural India from urban India. That's a very big mistake. You will not understand what's going on if you exoticize the rural, keep it as something very different from the rest. It's a very bad idea. 2, do not disconnect rural from global. The global volatility of prices is affecting rural third world countries massively because for 20 years through World Bank, IMF, you have shifted tens of millions of farmers from food crop to cash crop. Cash crop is where the volatility is. Overwhelmingly, the farmers who have committed suicide are cash crop farmers. Very few paddy farmers have committed suicide. At the end of the day, you can eat your rice, even if the price tanks. It's very hard to digest corn. People have been shifted to vanilla. Vanilla has 0 internal market in India. This is vanilla nation. Most of the vanilla in the world is consumed here. But the prescriptions are governments that want money, that want loans, that want something, should export-led growth. All these shibboleths of the 1980s, 1990s. It's fascinating to read the new IMF report. For America's financial crisis, it has entirely different prescriptions. No fiscal stringency. They should spend more. Exactly the opposite of the fatwas it gave to developing nations that needed to spend. Okay? Look at their report. It's quite fascinating. Entirely a complete somersault in the philosophies advanced. The other thing is, do not disconnect agriculture from the rest of what's going on in society. That's why I spoke so much about the inequality. Now, in India, 166,000 farmers committed suicide between 1997 and 2006. Now the new data coming out bringing another 16,600. So it goes up over 108,000 in 11 years. But for the decade 1997 to 2006, the government of India's figure is 166,344 farmers. Now, it's interesting if we break it up as the policy prescriptions get entrenched. Let's break up these 10 years into two bits of 5 years each. 97 to 2001, 2001 to 2006, okay? What does it show? It shows that in the second half, there's a huge jump in the number of suicides. In the second half, I mean, it's not 80,000, it's 70,000 and about 90,000, okay? Something like that, roughly. And in the second half, from 2002, on average, one farmer's suicide occurs every 30 minutes. Yeah. One every 30 minutes. Yeah. You take 87,000, divide by 5 years, you'll get the figure you said. Where do these numbers come from? They come from the National Crime Records Bureau, Government of India, Ministry of Home. In India, suicide statistics are gathered by the Crime Records Bureau. It's a crime. You commit suicide and we'll teach you never to do it again. So, yeah. Now, it's also astonishing that in this period of enormous distress and chaos in the countryside, and please note that it's as true of the Wall Street debacle also, one set of companies didn't do very badly. Food companies. They haven't done all that bad. At the time of the maximum distress in India, in the Indian countryside, the seed companies, the agricultural input companies made a killing, literally and figuratively and financially. Okay? If you look at, remember the time, people have, because of the meltdown, people have forgotten that in April, May, June this year, for the first time in living memory, middle classes in Western countries were worried about food prices. That's when George W. made his famous pronouncement on India and China. Right? At the time that you guys were getting worried about the food prices on your shelves, Archer Daniels Midland reported a record third quarter profit of 42%. Index funds dealing with agriculture, BlackRock, all of them posted huge profits. Vertical and horizontal integration are taking place. The same bunch of companies are buying everything from land and water to seed companies. Then two companies get together spawn a third company which creates fertilizer, which is what Mosaic is. It's a company created by two giant grain traders, and it starts becoming. So you're having vertical and horizontal integration at the same time. These index funds are buying up and investing in a fleet of barges for distribution of fertilizer. You see, one thing, it's a very, as Wall Street collapsed, you had one guy called Jim Rogers of Rogers Holdings Associates. He's always been making this very valid point. I have to say that his analysis is correct. He keeps telling people, you want to make money? Put it in food, put it in agriculture. That's where it is. Don't put it in these stupid, trashy bonds and shares. Jim Rogers has been giving this advice. You can go to the net and look at Rogers Holdings. He's been repeatedly saying it because he understands that if the world has to live without petrol, it will. You live some 200,000 years without it. But nobody's going to live without food and water. So agriculture is where the action is. Water is where the action is. Land is where the action is. And all these things, all those processes mean to be the policies packages that I put out. India is today in the midst of the greatest agrarian crisis in our history since the eve of the Green Revolution. Biggest displacement in our history. The growth of agriculture in the dynamic years of the reforms is less than half of what it was in the stagnant 80s. Okay, when it was 3.54%. Yeah. When did you cross 1.5% here? I'm not measuring by quarters. I'm talking about annual average growth rate of food production. For the first time in decades, in this decade, from let's say from 98, 99, for the first time in decades, growth rate of food production in India has fallen behind the growth rate of population. This was never the case in the 80s. It's fallen behind the growth rate of population when the growth rate of population is declining. Okay? When the growth rate of population is declining, it's fallen behind. That is an unsustainable, explosive situation which exploded in April, May, June. When you had near food riots in some places over the price issue. Meanwhile, high price volatility. Oh, remember, what does a farmer earn? What does a farmer earn? What is the consumer expenditure of the farmer? Remember the 51 guys who account for 31% of the GDP equivalent? The average monthly consumer expenditure of the farm household per individual is 503 rupees. That's $10. National Sample Survey Situational Assessment of Farmers Report. $10. Out of that $10, 60% goes directly on food. Yeah, because most Indian farmers are net purchasers of food grain. Their holdings do not support the family's diet. So over and above that, they have to buy apart from what they produce. So you have One end of the spectrum, guys earning $700,000 a minute. Another end of the spectrum, farmers, landowners whose monthly per capita expenditure is 503 rupees according to the government of India. Cultivation costs are soaring, and that's why the corporations and companies come in. Corporate farming does not exist in India in the way it does in the United States. Corporates do not do day-to-day agricultural operations because they can't own land in most states of the country. But in every other sector has been sown up. Seeds, pesticides. Now, for instance, if you were growing cotton, India and USA are rivals in the cotton trade. Cotton and coffee are the biggest non-edible, directly non-edible commodities in trade in the agriculture sector. If you were growing cotton in India in Vidarbha in 1991, 1 kilogram of seeds cost you 7 rupees. By the time Monsanto had done with us and brought its BT cotton, 450 grams packet was costing 1,800 rupees. That's $40. That's $35 now. Okay? So you're looking at seed costs going up. I'm not even getting into the science of whether it's good or bad, but you're seeing the multiplication in the input cost. Then a particular agriculture minister in the state of Andhra Pradesh took Monsanto to court. He took Monsanto to court and said, this is a rip-off, it doesn't cost this much, these guys are racketeers. Monsanto challenged the minister. Before the first hearing in the court, Monsanto's price mysteriously dropped from 1,650 and 1,800 rupees a bag to 925 rupees a bag. And it was still obviously making profits at the price. Bang! Now it's 725 rupees a bag. It turned out that the royalty being made per bag of 450 grams was between 1,200 and 1,400 rupees. Right, per bag. Go and ask your farmers what they pay for a bag of 450 grams of seeds. Meanwhile, corporate power meant that all agreements and standards in agriculture could be rewritten to suit the corporations. What? I'm sure, have many of you seen a bag of seed? On the back of every bag of seed, you'll find a stamp, minimum germination rate. It guarantees 90% of the seed. 100% of seed in a bag can never work because they don't work in nature in 100%. So you give a standard, 85%, 90% germination rate, and that much of the seed is guaranteed to work.